Mark Joyner, I think you can give up. There is no spoon. There is no spoon.
Mind control stuff doesn't work. Doesn't work.
I'm super excited about today's show, and I like to think of it as a conversation more than a show. I have Mark Joyner, the Mark Joyner, known as the father of digital marketing, and I have a book here that before the show I didn't pull up, but this is one of my favorite, absolute favorite books. And I'm not snowing you because people know me. I'm a Jersey person, and I don't lie, but this is one of my absolute favorite books. It's one of, I don't know if it's Mark Joyner's like first books original. It was my first introduction to Mark. So it's my first book of Mark Joyner's, but it's phenomenal. Plus it's mindcontrolmarketing.com. So anytime he got an interview on radio or TV, guess what they had to do? They had to say his domain name, which was fabulous. You'll see, I mark up my books. I have a ton of notes throughout here. It was a phenomenal book. And you've written how many? 24 more? Translated into 12 languages, 4 bestsellers.
Other way around. Yeah, 12 books in 24 languages. Yeah,
24 languages.
Something like that. Yeah.
Is it? You're in Phuket right now? Is it translated in Phuket?
There are some of my books in Thai, as a matter of fact. Yeah, which is quite.
It's interesting because when you say Phuket, a lot of people don't pronounce it that way. They say it differently, which we would start getting
Phuket.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yes.
So Mark and I are both broadcasting right now, facing the sunlight. He is watching the sun rise, and I'm watching the sun set from La Jolla. He's in Phuket.
Awesome.
But if you don't know Mark Joyner, just do a Google search. It's phenomenal. His accolades. And I really want to tap into the military intelligence background, not just the marketing background. And I actually have a personal trainer who served. And as you know, in the US, a lot of the gyms are still closed. He's ticked off. Mine just opened up outside only. He's been just going on a tear about how he did not sign up for this, like literally not sign up for this, the civil liberties, the freedoms, things like that. And a lot of what's happening right now, and in these 6 months before the election, there's mind control going on and manipulation from the media that nobody realizes, or not. I would say the masses don't realize this, Mark. You do. Your background provides a unique perspective. So can you just share a little bit about some of the accolades that you've served in the military with the intelligence background, so people know the background that you have as you share? And we're going to, by the way, I talked to Mark and he said no subject is off limits. So we're going to talk about a lot of current events and how the media is playing a role and how it's triggering you, me, Mark. Like none of us are immune to being triggered, and they're getting to our emotions. And what I call it, Mark, is personality marketing. They're taking advantage of personality marketing. They see our likes, they see what we like, comment on all of that, and they know how to manipulate us. They know how to trigger us. So give us your background, and then we'll dive into this mind control conversation.
Well, I'll just preface this by saying, while no topic is taboo here today, you just hit on the one thing that's like slightly taboo, and that's I can't get into everything that I did in the military intelligence community. So I worked for Army intelligence, working underneath the NSA. Specifically what I did, I can't really get into that, but I was in signals intelligence, and then worked, did some other things while I was working under the banner of signals intelligence. And that's about as much as I can say about that. But what I think is interesting is, when I talk about stuff like this, when you present people your experience, it's kind of good that I don't talk about it, because people can't verify that. So what I do is I say, look, okay, the fact that I have a background in military intelligence, all right, that shouldn't actually affect the conversation, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit this to what you can go verify on your own, right? So, when we talk about things, I can, reference things that people can go look up on their own, things that were revealed through the Freedom of Information Act, for example.
Right.
Just to let people know. So signals intelligence basically is, it's a process of, looking at broadcast signals to gather information about people, to collect information and figure out like what's happening. So the theater that I was working in was in the DPRK theater, which is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. So I was trained in the Korean language at the Defense Language Institute, and then went out and got other training, and did my job while serving in South Korea. And our job is basically to understand what's happening on the military battlefield, or the potential military battlefield on the peninsula.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that go on in that respect, but that's just sort of a shotgun blast.
And that's all you're allowed to say, which is fine. Which is fine.
Yeah, more or less.
When did you get into marketing? Like, when did you say transition into civilian life, get into online marketing? Because what you're doing or have been doing for at least the 20 years that's the first time I bought your product. And I think I bought your like going out of business sale. Like you had all of these like tracking pixels and things that didn't exist until a couple of years ago that marketers knew about. And I'm like, I want this course, right? So as far as I knew, you were doing this for 20 years. So were you doing this while you were in the military, when you got out? When did you get into it?
Yeah, so I started, so it's very interesting that the course that I followed there. So I started doing digital marketing, what we call digital marketing now. Back then we didn't even really have a name for it. And I started doing it in the very, very early 90s, like in actual, I think it was 1990. And back then there wasn't any playbook, there wasn't a guidebook on how to do marketing. I didn't have any experience in business. I didn't have any experience in marketing. I didn't know anything about any of that stuff. I started playing around on the internet and also on bulletin board systems. That was sort of a proto internet before that. And in fact, my first digital publishing was using bulletin board systems to sell a course on teaching people how to go get free language training from the government, right? So that was kind of a cool, interesting headline. And so what I did was I started, developing my own playbook based on, things that I knew from military strategy and martial arts and things like that. And then also, just understanding hard psychology. And then that, sort of became the playbook that I used for the digital marketing platforms. And then I started getting exposed to, it was, I think around probably 95, 96, where I started getting exposed to actual marketers, right? That was, I think, when I met Joe Vitale, was way back then. And he was actually, he actually knew marketing. He had studied direct response and had, knew all of the greats and all that. I started getting exposed to guys like that. And I was like, okay, it's interesting to find out what, they had concluded, what was similar and what was different from what I was doing. And there were some similarities and some differences, which was quite cool.
Are you seeing right now what's happening? And I'm talking in the past, say, since March 2020 till August now. Are you seeing certain things that you were indoctrinated in the military happening now? Whether it's media, whether it's governments, whether it's world, because it's not just the US. Again, you're not even in the US right now. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the correlations and some of the, again, getting into the mind control, the manipulation of the masses?
Yeah. Well, I mean, without, talking about, what I learned, back then, I mean, I think that what's interesting is that people can, look at what's happening in the world right now and understand on the surface of it, what's going on. And it's quite plain that obviously our minds are being conditioned. I think it's ridiculous to deny that. Clearly, there is some kind of a campaign going on to convince people to behave a certain way. And if you're going to say that's not happening, well, it's like, how do you get to that? So obviously something is happening. So the question is, why are they doing it? What are the real motivations? Are the stated motivations the same as the real motivations? That's what we cannot know. Right. But there are things that we can see on the surface that are quite clear. So what do you do to change someone's mind, right? What do you do to get someone to go along with your will? And, a couple of the very, very powerful psychological phenomena that are at play right now, which, regardless of what one thinks about the efficacy of the lockdown or the actual intentions of the lockdown or what have you, or the reality of the virus, whatever one thinks of all of that, there are certain things that we can observe clearly, right? So for example, one of the most powerful forces in understanding what persuades people to behave a certain way is a psychological phenomenon known as obedience to authority, right?
You actually talk about that in this book, by the way.
That's right. As a matter of fact, that is, and that has remained consistently reliable over time. And I think one of the reasons why it's so reliable is that one of the models of persuasion is what's known as the heuristic systemic model. And it's basically this notion that, look, we're bombarded by information, so we need, right there, chapter 8, or one of the, let's see, chapter 2. Chapter 2, chapter 2 is authority. It's been so long since I've looked at that. So we're bombarded with information, and way more information than we can process. So we have to use heuristics or shortcuts to make decisions on the information that's presented to us. And one of the most common shortcuts is like, okay, well, who's in power right now? Who has authority? Let me ask them, let me follow their lead. So right now, we have all of the, people, they're in their lab coats coming out, from the WHO telling you, you should do this. And we have a response, a trained response when we see a lab coat. It's like, oh, okay, I have to listen to this person.
Yeah.
And if people think, well, okay, that sounds a little, to talk about that kind of thing, people all of a sudden get very uncomfortable because they think that, so I'm going to address Adrian's question here in a minute. So just to make this very clear, when people get uncomfortable about this, I find it very amusing, right? Because these are phenomena that are for sure at play. It's obvious that they're going on. They're things that happen on a day-to-day basis, right? In this notion that that people in authority are not using their authority to persuade us is obviously quite absurd, I would say, right? So so to Adrian's question, which says, obviously, I would love to hear what you're seeing. I feel like everyone sees different pieces. Well, let me talk about some historical stuff first. Okay, so one of the things that's very clear. So Stanley Milgram did some very interesting experimentation about this. One that's more famous is Zimbardo's prison experiment, right? So in Zimbardo's prison experiment, what he found was that there were people who started adopting the persona of being a prison guard, and people who started adopting a persona of being a prisoner, right? And their behavior started to conform to that. And the prisoners, had to listen to the authority of these fake guards, and they followed the guards. Now, Stanley Milgram's experiment is even more interesting. So Stanley Milgram, what he did was in psychology, in the research, there are often, what are known as sort of like dupes and confederates, right? And the dupe is a guy who you're actually conducting the experiment on. He doesn't realize that he is the subject of a psychological experiment. So what they did was they took a guy, he didn't realize that he was a subject, and they put a fake subject who was actually the confederate of the thing. And they said, okay, we're going to give this man a series of questions, and every time he gets an answer wrong, I want you to administer a series of shocks. And the shocks went from like 1 to 10 to X to triple X, right?
Yeah.
And then so the actual subject of the experiment was told by the man in the lab coats, administer a shock because they got the question wrong, all right? Now, they would go ahead and comply, and then the confederate in the other room, who the subject of the experiment thought was the subject of the experiment, was starting to like let out increasingly loud screams until it got to a point where it was blood curdling, and they thought that the person was going to die. It was quite clear that they even said, hey, look, if I administer one more shock of an X higher value, it's going to kill this person. Yeah. And the person in the lab coat, right, would say, we take full responsibility, administer the shock. Yeah. Now, it's very interesting, that language, right? So when an authority figure tells you to do something and they're saying we take responsibility, now all of a sudden your responsibility is absolved, right? Yep. Because you're just going along. You're just going along. All right. Right. So I think you're just
following orders.
You're just following orders. Right. So about 87% of the people who were told to administer the shocks administered the shocks. And that observation was so profoundly interesting. And that is something that has been observed over and over and over again. And we can observe it empirically in our marketing. So for example, if you use authority to market yourself, and by the way, if you're face to camera, anybody, you're using your authority to market. You may not realize it, but that's what you're doing, right? Right. And it makes our marketing more effective when we have effectively either established ourselves in authority, or we have people who are established authorities endorsing us or recommending us, right? And that is a very clearly observed phenomenon.
Yeah. And one of the things you were talking about as far as how do we convince other people? So I think I know the answer. You hold on to your position really tightly and just keep proving that, while this person holds on to their position tightly, and you just fight. and you yell at each other and you call each other names, because that's what we're seeing, right? Like we're seeing this all over Facebook, and it's only getting worse. It's only increasing. And I looked at it, and I'm watching this since March, because first it was a 2-week, hey, let's just lock down everything to slow the spread and make sure that hospitals weren't overwhelmed. And it went from 2 weeks to 2 months, and people were starting to just lose their mind, right? They're getting frustrated. They are out of work. They don't see the hope. So they're getting frustrated, and they go online and they just lash out whatever frustrates. It's like the kick the dog analogy, right? It's like go, your boss yells at you, you come home, right? And that's the least vulnerable. So, and what's interesting is, because it's all behind, you're not face to face, you're not afraid anyone's just going to punch you out because you're saying something mean to someone that you wouldn't in person, right? So like I did this social experiment for the most part, right in the beginning, when first we're allowed to like go out, and like I thought Costco and everything was closed during apparently they weren't, they were never, but so I went and I had the mask, but I wore the mask. The first one I got, it was a weird kind of thing where unless you went like that. So it went around my ears, but it almost looked like a thong, or like a Hannibal Lecter thing. Like it was like this. So it wasn't like this, it was like that, right? And I was, again, completely covering it, but it was different. And I got a lot of looks, right? But how many people would you guess said something to me? What was your...
I would say, normally I would say very few, but in this climate, I would say maybe more than normal, because I mean, it's becoming acceptable to get in people's faces about stuff. 0 people said anything. Okay,
no one said anything. And again, I got some weird looks, but no one said anything. And yet online, I see people freaking out over like the littlest things, especially masks, no masks. And then I want you to speak to this too, because I think, again, masks became a political thing. And then people are even showing stats. Oh, it's a political thing. It's not. Like, I know people from both parties, like from one party and like, I'm going to say Democrats, and they don't like masks, right? We have Point Loma down here. A lot of let's just say there's these hippie guys that go out and they're spinning fire and they're anti-mask. I don't think they're Trump supporters. And then I have a friend who like said she voted for Trump. She had a whole box of 1,000 masks right in the beginning of this, because she was following the Wuhan epidemic, right? So she was ready, right? And then all of a sudden became this. So it's not a political thing, but once again, someone's triggering it. Someone says it, and then it gets repeated and shared and shared and shared. And I think if you could speak a little bit to this, because I feel like now we've got cognitive dissonance, again, another topic you talk about in your book. And once someone has a belief, they're holding on to it. And that's kind of that was my assumption. And you can correct me or expand upon it, is Fauci came out and originally there were no masks. We needed them for the front line. He's like, they don't do anything. Don't buy them. Don't go out and buy them, because he was afraid it wouldn't be for the front line people who really needed them. Then all of a sudden it changed and said, okay, now it's mandatory. Like Newsom has it mandatory if you go to a gym, if you go anywhere in public. However, if you are one of those people who were told from Fauci or told from a white coat, you had a belief in your mind, right? Yeah. So, and then some people, again, from the beginning, like my friend still does, right? So talk a little bit about that, if either what I talked about or something else to expand upon that. Like, why is there such a craziness around this topic, and there is no changing minds, and there's a lot of name calling on other side. Like if you're anti-masker or if you're a yes pro-masker, both of them think the other side are idiots, right? Like you're an idiot. So
well, that's the funny thing is the person who's labeled as an idiot is going to remain an idiot, period, no matter, even if you change your stance on something. So I'll give you a really interesting example. So I remember and whatever one thinks about Trump or whatever, like I don't care, right? Like, I mean, people can have their opinions.
You're in Phuket, so you have no, what is it, dog in the show?
I have no, but I'm still an American citizen, right? And I love my country.
So you could mail in.
Oh, I totally could. Yeah. Well, I mean, I could do an absentee. Yeah. And I mean, which is, by the way, that's a whole other very interesting conversation that's going on right now. But, one very interesting example to point out, which kind of is analogous to what you're talking about, is when the whole thing started. And by the way, I actually got access to a lot of information about this. I don't want to talk about how, but before this whole thing broke out, I was actually kind of like party to some information passing about it. So I kind of knew that there was a little more to it, than China was saying in the beginning, right? So remember, in the beginning, it was just like, this is this weird thing happening in China. Well, Trump actually instituted a travel ban.
Right.
And then all of the Democrats were out there, pillorying Trump, saying it was xenophobic.
Correct.
There's even video there that people can go look up of Nancy Pelosi going into Chinatown, telling everybody, come to Chinatown. And they were using that as a moment of political opportunism to make Trump look bad. Right. So again, whatever one thinks about Trump, I mean, let's use this as a moment to examine our own behaviors, right? Are we going to be so consistent with our worldview that even as the facts on the ground change, we're going to remain consistent with our identity with that party, and we're just going to go along and parrot exactly what they say? Are we going to do that, or are we actually going to think for ourselves and decide on matters regardless of what our party says about it? Because then when everything switched over and it was like, oh, well, Trump should have locked down earlier, right? and because he didn't lock down, now it's Trump's fault, right? And again, whatever people think about Trump, that's a very interesting phenomenon to observe on all fronts. Yeah.
And what I want to talk about too, because again, we're getting a little bit into politics, but I want to have people think beyond that, where, and we had a brief conversation right before we went live, as far as this may be the moment in history where people get sick of both their parties. They see they're being manipulated by both of their parties. They see they're being pawns. They see they're being triggered. So that's kind of what I want to expose. So we can, whether it's in 4 years or whatever, we can get our America back, right? Or the world back. Because a lot of people tune in from all over the world here. It's not just Americans, but and you talked about like this may be a time where people are starting to open up to a third party, and whether it's within the party or not, or within one of the two parties, people are starting to get sick and tired of both parties equally. And here's another thing I see, Mark, and you could talk about this or just expand back on what we were just talking about, where people are not even voting for someone, they're voting against someone on both sides. So I have friends on all sides, like actually Libertarian, Democrat, and Republican.
Same.
Things like I'm voting against Trump, I'm voting against Biden, and then some people will independent. So, and I'm like, I'm not seeing now. Again, some people are very passionate about someone that they're voting for, but so that's what I'm seeing. It's like this anti-vote, and it's like, well, let's start thinking for ourselves. So that's kind of what I want to get. I want to get beyond the politics, and how do people guard their mind? How do people see what's happening? So that's the other thing. Before they react, before they get emotionally charged over a post that they see that is literally designed to get them emotionally charged. So talk a little bit about that. Like, who's behind some of the, like, all of a sudden we see it when it's gone viral. Oh, it starts somewhere. And I don't think people realize how many ads are being bought by both political parties at a furious rate in the 6-month span from June up until November. So talk a little bit about how it's being manipulated. I feel like so manipulated, right? And I almost want to just give up social media until the end of November.
I know. I gotta tell you, I contemplate it about once a day myself. It's like I just get so frustrated with it, and I'm fighting this battle. I mean, you've probably seen, like on my social media, I'm always trying to kind of poke the bear a little bit and get people to think and engage with each other. And sometimes the engagement gets quite heated, and people will accuse me of like trying to stir the pot. And it's like, no, man, I just want to have a conversation. And if me posting a question that allows people to debate is me stirring the pot, then we got to question what this pot is right now, because the pot is supposed to be a melting pot, where we're allowed to have free speech and engage with each other and discuss ideas. It's not a place, as far as I was not raised to believe that the United States was a place where free speech was taboo. Right. But now it's becoming increasingly taboo. Now, to your question about who's actually doing all of this, that's the sort of the $1 million question. Nobody knows, but we can know through history that, and by the way, as the sun starts going up brighter and brighter, I might have to close my curtains here. I'm gonna start looking like Jesus here in a minute.
Blushing.
Well, blushing and glowing. So, so the first of all, we have to establish the fact that control of the media happens. Okay. And it's happening far more frequently than people realize. And I would say that, I mean, it's indisputable that governments, intelligence agencies, corporations, interest groups, et cetera, have a hand in controlling what is seen by people, right? That is extremely well established. I'll give you some points of reference, right? So for example, and just to let you know how deep this rabbit hole goes, I'll give you two cases that I love to bring up because they're so illustrative of larger things. So one is when the De Beers Corporation started creating the myth that diamonds were a thing that everybody needed to buy, which, by the way, is a manufactured phenomenon. That, you know, this is not a, you know, an age-old tradition to buy diamond rings. I mean, rings were certainly a thing in certain cultures, but diamond rings were not. So the De Beers Corporation, in their propaganda ploy to get people to believe that diamond rings are a must-have, they started having script writers, you know, add music. You know, this is where diamonds are a girl's best friend. That was a you know, paid product placement by De Beers in that film.
Yes,
it's who they are. Yes. No. It's who you've been conditioned to be, right? Yeah.
It's free speech. You could say whatever you want, Mark Joyner.
Right on.
Okay, no, this
right
is good.
On.
This is excellent.
That's
really good.
That's the fist all raised in the air.
Yeah.
Is for,
diamonds.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
good. Yeah. It's a marketing campaign, and we're so marketed by so many things. So this is good. This is I'm actually getting direct texts that are saying, this is really good. I'm like, throw that in the comments. You don't have to send me a direct text, but they're loving the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, right on. Awesome. So yeah, the De Beers case is one very clear one where there's a corporate interest that's controlling media. And they actually, you know, did hire people in, you know, journalism to write, you know, puff pieces about diamonds and to create this perception that this was the reality. And there was even a line in one of the films that they had where, you know, there's a female character saying, well, every self-respecting man knows that he's got to spend 3 months of his salary on a diamond engagement ring for his sweetheart if he really loves her, right? And it's like, damn, okay, like really? I mean, that's some pretty intense. That's some pretty intense mind control going on there. You know, for somebody to have their defenses down as they would have them while watching a film, and then to have a line like that, which is straight up, you know, psychological aggression inflicted on someone. To me, that's pretty egregious stuff. Now, to give you another example, so a lot of people are not aware that in Iran, before the Shah came to power, there was an era of history there where we had, you know, a democratically elected government. And the last president of Iran was a gentleman by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh. And Mossadegh wanted to nationalize the oil industry in Iran because it was basically controlled by the Brits. And BP, British Petroleum, you know, was not giving them what Mossadegh thought was a fair cut of their own oil. So he said, okay, we're going to nationalize it. Then the British government went to the US government and said, hey, let's go to war with Iran over this. And then US government said, well, let's not go to war. What we're going to do is we're going to send our troops in. Now, by the way, you guys can Google this and just type in Operation Ajax, and you can get all of this information. The Freedom of Information Act has revealed all this information. So everything I'm about to tell you is totally verifiable, independently verifiable. So,
and you're allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, this is all Freedom of Information Act stuff, right? So there's no harm in like showing something that's already been leaked.
Yep.
You know, and so Freedom of Information Act, I mean, it's not a leak as such. It's actually, you know, it's a deliberate process that we go through to declassify information. So Kermit Roosevelt was FDR's grandson, and he was in the CIA, and he was hired to go run Operation Ajax. And the purpose of Operation Ajax was to go and subvert the authority of Mohammad Mossadegh through the media and through the creation of fake protests. Okay, so, you know, any connection to current events, you know, you're allowed to draw those conclusions on your own. I'm not going to draw any correlations there. You can go research that yourself and see if there's any correlation. But so they hired fake protesters and stooges to go into the streets and say, Mossadegh is a socialist and he's going to, you know, because he wants to nationalize the oil, that's a clear signal that he's a socialist. He's going to destroy our country. You know, and this was fresh off the heels of the Cultural Revolution in China, right? So people who knew about the atrocities, I mean, just absolute obscene atrocities of the Cultural Revolution, saw that and they said, okay, so we don't want socialism in our country. And then add to that, they had media figures that they bribed to cover the protests and to say that their opinion was that Mossadegh was a socialist. Now, what this allowed for was for the Shah of Iran to come in and subvert the power of Mossadegh, to seize the power. They created the ground, the fertile ground in which that could occur. Now, the really interesting thing, and this is not necessarily apropos to this conversation, but the interesting thing that happened as a result of that was that we had this thing that is known as blowback. So certain aggressive intelligence operations often have blowback that cause unintended consequences. And one of the unintended consequences of Operation Ajax was that it allowed for the Islamic Revolution in Iran to occur. So if we had not actually done what we did in Iran, all right, and by the way, that was all straight controlled by the US government, all right, if we had not done that, then there, it would not be a theocracy in Iran right now. Very unlikely that it would be a theocracy. It would probably still be, a democratically controlled government, as it was before we interfered. So I'm just giving those two examples. So if people think that the media is not manipulated, or that news is not manipulated, or that fake news is a new thing, dude, I'll just say one last thing, just to interject one last thing before you ask your question. So in The Art of War, there's a whole chapter about spies, okay? And they talk about the spreading of misinformation. This is, way back to, The Art of War. And it goes further back than that. I don't think that even warfare has occurred without information warfare occurring simultaneously. Yes. At least not if you're an intelligent commander.
Yeah. I'm actually pulling up on my screen. Of course, I'm going to disappear for myself. I'm looking at your most recent book, your Roadmap to Money. I had signed up. I'm seeing your ads and your promos for your book everywhere, by the way. It's like, oh, sure. Awesome. Once I start talking to Mark, I'm going to get your ads now. But it's phenomenal. I read this in the weekend. And of course, you have, I'm going to try to pull this up. Let me just see. Let's see if I can pull this up because it's, no, I'm not. But we'll get a way for you to get this book before the end of the show. But it's your Roadmap to Money in 2020. And I was just reading that before I got on the show. So it's like midway through the book. And you're talking about Sun Tzu and the fake news. So fake news, I was reading this and you're like, everyone thinks this is a recent thing. This is not a recent thing. It's not even a social media thing, right? Because I'm thinking, oh, great, this is all social media's fault. I'm starting to regret ever promoting Twitter from back in 2006. And it was from way back when. So talk a little bit more about fake news. And by the way, people are loving this. Also, Leon was also referring as far as marketing, right? Like De Beers with diamonds. And then Liam mentioned about All the American Breakfast of bacon and eggs, also a product of marketing. Right. Yeah. So that's another thing that wasn't even a thing until a marketing company said, okay, how do we sell? What was it? More bacon or more eggs? Let's combine them, bacon and eggs. Right.
And God bless him. God bless him for making bacon. Right?
Yeah. I know about the diamonds campaign.
Hey, right on. If you're okay with it.
I like diamonds.
Yeah. Right on. So, so by the way, the URL that people can go to, roadmaptomoney.vip. Is a URL guys can go to, roadmaptomoney.vip, and you guys can get it for free. This is going to come out as a print book, and it's actually going to turn into your Roadmap to Money in the 2020s, right? Because 2020 is almost over now. But it turns out, that this book has done so well, that we're going to probably carry this on for several years, and I'm going to continue to update it because, it's. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I mean, definitely a lot of effort went into that. I intended for it to be a 20-page report, and it ended up becoming a 378-page book, with lots of images. So don't be intimidated by the link. I mean, there's lots of pictures, and I make it very easy to read. Most people read it in one sitting. But to get to back to fake news, your question about how far back that goes. Well, I mean, we don't even have to go back that far in history to see some very, very clear examples. Just Google the term yellow journalism. And, William Randolph Hearst's papers were all, cool, thank you. Were all, basically propaganda outlets. And, these were, mouthpieces for hire. And Hearst would use that power so that he could shore up and get more power himself. And he would use it, to create political alliances with people. Super well documented, right? And that was in the 20th century. And I think that's what's funny is that people think that yellow journalism went away, and it's like, no, it didn't go away. It just changed its colors. It's a chameleon, And I mean, yeah, it's been going on probably since the dawn of recorded history. And here, I'm just going to step over here for a second so I can turn on my air conditioner. As the sun comes up in Thailand, it starts getting hot. Yeah. So, but I can keep talking. So
I'll keep showing the screen. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, this is something that's been going on since the dawn of recorded history. It's going to continue to go on. It's pretty blatant and egregious. People who don't think it exists, are clearly, just not aware or are willfully unaware.
Mm-hmm. You even talked about self-driving cars, robotics. Let's get into a little bit of this, where you look at technology. And I had Jeremiah Alyang on the show. She's probably right before coronavirus all started. And but he was also on the TV show, and he talked about like these self-driving cars. And I told him, like, I'm a race car driver. I love cars. I'm so anti self-driving cars, right? Yeah. Stop sharing the screen here, bring you back here. But I'm like, no, I don't want self-driving cars. I like driving. And then I started looking and how we have so many distracted drivers, and I'm starting to get convinced. And now this is a perfect example. He came on the show and he just put my mind to ease about the future of self-driving cars, that they would be a good thing, not a bad thing. And I my right wouldn't be taken away. I could still race around when I want in my Cayman S, right? So I was like, okay, that's good, right? And I figure in my near future. But so he actually was really good at changing my mind in that. So talk a little bit about some of the future of robotics, right? Because that's one of the other things that talk about in the conspiracy thing, 5G, robotics, people spying on it. Like there's so many topics, and you talk about a lot of these things and more. But let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's a very interesting subject about how I look at this whole lockdown as this has accelerated the digital revolution, right? You and I have been doing this for 20 some years, right? You longer than me. But for 20 years, I've been working from home, so when in the beginning, month in, I was like, well, this is kind of normal life for me, right? Like if anything, it just gave me an excuse not to go to things because I was busy writing my third book. But I've been doing this forever, and I found like everything 30% up in views, YouTube, Facebook, live shows. Everyone in the digital era was getting more views, more buys, like more purchases. People were buying more things online, more digital information. So I'm seeing this whole thing as accelerating that. So while I want the economy to open up, I'm such a fan and what would you say, advocate, crusader of the small business owner, the mom and pop. I mean, that's how both my immigrant grandparents came to this country, started a small business. They couldn't survive if their business was shut down. So I'm like, there were a certain amount of risk, but at the same time, me personally, hey, the lockdown could continue forever because my business will only expand, right? So it's like, I think most people are looking at things and going, well, I think this or I think that. I'm like, okay, well, what if we said no internet? Then would you still be stay home? If you couldn't make any money, what if your Social Security check was gone? What if you weren't getting a check? What if all of a sudden you couldn't show real estate and Redfin took over? All of a sudden we would get people that are personally affected. The politicians, what if we told all the politicians, as long as we all have to stay home and shut down the small mom and pop, the politicians don't get paid, right? So I get very passionate about the subject. So let's talk a little bit about technology, some of that. And maybe let's talk about some conspiracy theories if you'd like.
So conspiracy theories is very interesting. We'll get to that. I think I find it very funny that the term is a pejorative, as if conspiracies have never existed. History is a story. It's a history of conspiracies, if you look at what's gone on, when you plan to attack another country in secret, and you do it with another country, that's a conspiracy, that's clearly they have occurred. So Robin,
he's asking, what is the document? I believe he is referring to roadmaptomoney.vip.
Yeah.
So you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Yeah, and then I'll loop back around to the other stuff about technology, because, well, in fact, it's quite apropos he's asking that, because the whole purpose of it is to explain to people that the real conversation that we need to be having right now is the technological discussion. Right. So for me, I think that, discussion about politics is totally irrelevant when we're talking about or when we're failing to talk about the technological landscape in which all of those events occur. So, for example, to his question, which will kind of serve as a nice segue into the larger technology discussion. All right. So we are at an era right now where we can 3D print automatic weapons. Okay. That is a thing. That is a thing. Book. Yeah, it's in there, right? Yeah, and so the government's answer to that, by the way, is, well, we'll just make it illegal to share the plans. You can get a 3D printer, by the way, for like $100 on Amazon today. It's crazy. So if we can 3D print weapons and the government says, well, we're going to, make it illegal, so they're problem solved. But I would say, well, yeah, like that did anything for piracy, right? I mean, come on, piracy of digital content still occurred after you made it illegal. And it's probably growing, right? So, good luck with that, making the plan for 3D weapons, illegal. So the interesting thing is everybody's still having this gun control debate. And I think, how are we talking about gun control when we can 3D print automatic weapons, as if we're going to be able to stem the tide of the existence of weapons? And then further, the larger thing that we have to understand is that this is all in the context of the exponential growth of technology, the exponential pace at which technology is continuing to advance. So one of the things I talk about in the book is what I call the big five phenomena. Everything is getting faster, smaller, more powerful, cheaper, and more available, right? And that's happening to everything, including weapons technology, right? So if we're talking about, controlling the distribution of small arms, that's like, why are we having last century's debate, right? If we were just to simply look at the reality of what's happening on the technological landscape, and if we were to look at the reality of the rapid pace of change, and to help everybody understand that how fast things are moving. So Moore's law states that every 18 months, because transistors are getting smaller and whatnot, now that's the technical side of it, but the practical side of Moore's law is that every 18 months-ish, computers get twice as fast and half as expensive, right? And that has been astonishingly accurate at predicting the pace of microprocessor advancement. Now that phenomenon has been observed actually throughout history, right? So if you look at the period of time historically between a paradigm shifting discovery or invention, that period of time has been having itself throughout history. So if imagine the first paradigm shift occurred over the course of 100,000 years, and the next one happened at 50,000 years, the next one at 25,000, then at 12,500, and so on and so on and so on. We're at a point now where everything is moving so fast that we're experiencing a paradigm shift in one field or another every single day. I mean, let that sink in, right? That's how fast everything is changing. So when we talk about 3D printed automatic weapons, people say, well, 3D printed automatic weapons is one thing, but how serious can it get? Well, let me give you an example. I mean, just, if you were to plot the advancement of weapons growth over a graph, and you were to show that it was an exponential growth curve upward, I like to point the arrow, like we are here, right? We are right at the curve, right? Well, to let you know how serious that's becoming, just in, when was it? 2018, President Maduro of Venezuela had an assassination attempt on his life using explosives strapped to a commercially purchased drone, right? So somebody bought this drone over the internet, and they strapped explosives to them. Now, thank goodness for Maduro's sake, his staff or his bodyguards were able to deploy ballistic shields fast enough to protect him. But the point is that is the exponential growth rate that we're looking at here. So 3D printed automatic weapons is one thing. Well, how soon before we have 3D printed weapons of mass destruction? Now, I would say it's probably pretty safe to say that if the trends continue as they have been, we are going to go on that path. Now, you talked about some of the other, cases there, like 5G, Internet of Things.
Explain that, because a lot of people, there's a lot of debate, and again, I'm seeing and I'm like, okay, I need to do more research, and then I'm in the tech Silicon Valley conversation, so they'll get into things, and then other people. So tell people what it is, and then some of the implications of 5G, and then why are people afraid of it, and should they be or should they not be? What are your thoughts? Again,
it's a really good question. Free speech. So first, let me seed the everybody's mind a little bit with a concept known as astroturf. First of all. Right, so astroturfing is where, and by the way, I think it's what's the lady's name? There's her name will come to me, but she's a great advocate of teaching. Cheryl Atkinson, I think, is her name. So she's actually taught people about the prevalence of astroturfing on the internet right now. Basically, it's controlling the information landscape so that your desired view on a particular topic is what people find when they search for information. Right, so a lot of people think, well, if the information is out there, it's available. Well, no, you have to understand the dynamics of what happens when somebody searches for something. right? Their perception of what is reality is going to be defined normally by the first 2 pages at most of the SERPs, the search engine results pages, right? So this astroturfing phenomenon has been going on for a long time. It's analogous to fake news, but it's a way of getting fake news to proliferate so that people don't find alternative sources.
Right.
And that is happening with the 5G debate. There is very little information that's available to most people. All right. So to talk about 5G, so 5G stands for 5th generation cellular. We're not talking about 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, even though they're actually on similar bandwidths. So the effects on the human body may be similar. 5G cellular, 5th generation cellular, is just as much of an exponential leap ahead as 4G was compared to 3G. Now, if you remember with your phones, I'm seeing if I have one of my phones handy here. When you had a 3G phone, you couldn't really watch a video on that thing unless you were prepared to sit down and let it download for like an hour. Right.
Yeah.
But when 4G came, it's like now we can suddenly stream video on our phones. Now everything is very different. Now we can actually practically get apps on our phones. We don't have to go to a Wi-Fi hotspot to get an app downloaded onto our phone. We can download that damn app onto our phone mobily. That's how big 4G was. Now 5G is going to be this. So right now in the 4G world, when you call an Uber, right, you have your phone, and then you basically type in where you want to go, and then it sends you information back. Here's how it's going to be in 5G. Because 5G is so high in frequency, the higher the frequency, the shorter the range of the signal. So we're going to have a massive sea of 5G towers all over the world. So we're all going to be saturated in the signal. And that is going to subsequently help facilitate another phenomenon known as the Internet of Things. Now, some of these things that are going to be connected to these 5G towers are all sorts of sensors, right? So we'll have things to identify people's faces, things to identify people's voices. So in the 5G world, when 5G rolls out, you're going to walk out, and instead of like pulling out a device, you're gonna say, "Hey, I need an Uber to go to wherever you're going," and you're gonna hear a voice somewhere off in the distance saying, "Okay, your Uber's on the way, Deb."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's 5G.
It's like talking to Siri or Alexa or whoever, and I hope I don't wake these people up.
But everywhere.
Without having a device. Yeah.
That's the implications of 5G. Now, in terms of the health risks, there has been an astroturfing campaign telling people that 5G is perfectly safe. I don't have an opinion about it because I have not dug deeply enough into the science to have any opinion. And I think these things are fairly new. However, I would say that there are clearly some scientific indicators that we should be concerned. Okay, so for example, you don't even have to go outside of the mainstream sources. You can go to Scientific American, where there are scientists saying, hey, maybe we should be a little bit concerned about 5G. Let's not all run with the bandwagon. So now, whatever people feel on that debate, that's fine. Like, if you think that the people who are concerned are crazy, if you think that the people who are not concerned are, have their head buried in the sand, fine, whatever. Okay, I mean, let's look at the data and let's hash that out. I remember recently there was some guy who brought up 5G as an example of things that crazy conspiracy theorists believe. And I responded to him saying, well, here's the Scientific American saying this. This is clearly not outside of the mainstream to be concerned about the potential health risks of 5G. And by the way, 4G is, the effects on the cellular level of those signals are radically different. Again, this is an exponential leap in the speed of the signal. It's so much denser and so much faster of a bandwidth. It's, sure, the effect, the effects are as different as the difference between the light that's coming from the sun and a microwave. Okay. If you want to say that, well, it's just a signal, signals are signals. No, man, you're apparently not aware of actual physics, because, the frequency of signals change their behavior. Now, here's the problem. We may not have any choice. We may not have any choice because if we don't roll 5G out, what happens if China rolls out 5G? Now, before somebody, freaks out and says, oh my God, he's a racist. No, I'm not a racist. I'm aware that countries make decisions, right? I have, I'm going to make that classic statement. I have a lot of Chinese friends, right? But we have to be aware that, mainland China is very, very different from Chinese culture, right? Mainland China actually purged Chinese culture from itself during the Cultural Revolution. And a lot of people think that if you want to find real Chinese culture, you got to go to Taiwan or Hong Kong or Singapore now, because China actually purged their culture. Now, one thing that we know for sure that's going on in China is that China is doing a lot of draconian stuff to their citizenry. Now, for example, you may remember the Black Mirror episode that was all about a social credit system, right? Well, China is actually rolling out a social credit system to their populace right now. That's a real thing.
Talk a little bit about that, because I don't think a lot of people watching the show know. By the way, Veronica is loving this. We have a question from Adrian about kind of hope and how do we find information. But we just had Joel Comm on the show last week because we were talking about TikTok or not. And Owen Video has used it, and he's using it for good and trying to encourage business owners. But Joel Comm was very adamant about what the Chinese government, the CCP, is doing, and they're part to their own people. So I think the viewers have heard this. They're not going to judge you. And again, for me, I think we share information, we get information. Again, that's what America's been all about. You're free to hear information and then judge for yourself and make an opinion. Like TikTok, decide, like, okay, are they spying on you? Are they not spying? Is it good for kids? Is it not good for kids? Is it scraping your login? And then decide whether you want to use it or whether you want to put it on a phone that maybe it's not your everyday phone. So talk a little bit about what about that I think a lot of people don't. And Phuket is sun has risen in Phuket.
Yeah, it's actually in about 15 minutes. It's gonna come over the crest of the window. Yeah, so
that could be good or bad.
No, it'll look better. It'll look better. I won't look as bright. So So the Chinese Communist Party is still in power. This is Chairman Mao's government, and Chairman Mao was arguably the greatest mass murderer in the history of all time, depending on whether you want to count his the famines that he was responsible for and all of that. But I mean, he's roughly responsible for democide, in the range of about 80 million people. All right, and one of the things that they are doing right now in China, in mainland China, which is where the Chinese Communist Party is in power, is that they're rolling out a social credit system, meaning that your behavior as a human being is going to be judged on a credit system very similar to the way your financial credit is judged by the financial credit system in the United States. Okay, so your credit score is very similar. It's analogous to what they're doing in China in terms of your social credit. And your social credit is going to be determined by, are you paying your bills? Are people rating you negatively or positively on your behavior? And if your social credit score goes too low, just like that Black Mirror episode, mind you, by the way, I mean, it's literally straight out of that episode. I don't know if you guys have seen that episode or not. I think it was like maybe the first episode of Black Mirror. And but I'm pretty sure it was in season 1.
First one had a pig in it. I think that was the last episode I watched.
Yeah. Actually, Black Mirror is actually quite good science fiction, by the way. As a side note, good science fiction is supposed to ask questions about how technology is going to shape the world. And to me, it's one of the most important forms of literature there are. And Black Mirror is actually exceptionally good. I mean, I remember that pig one now, and that was.
I was like, so uncomfortable.
Yeah, I was super uncomfortable too. However, I would say go watch some of the rest because they ask profoundly important questions. And that one was actually asking a profoundly important question.
Yes.
There was, that was, about the implications of the effect of technology on human behavior, and on everything around us. So anyway, in China right now, you cannot get a train if your social credit score is too low. You can't fly. They're taking away your rights if your social credit score is too low. Now, so people might think, well, that's not a bad thing. I mean, if you're acting like a dick out in public, I mean, shouldn't people be able to judge you? Well, a dick according to whom, right? I'm here in the United States now. Well, I'm actually in Thailand, but you get canceled in the United States.
It's almost like the same thing. The credit score or whatever you have there is the cancel culture here. If we don't like something someone says, we cancel them.
Yeah, and that's just absurd. It's just it's ridiculous to do that, as far as I'm concerned. For me, I mean, look, when people do bad things, we should be also free to be able to speak our mind about that, right, and say things. But I mean, I'm going to give it. This is a terrible example. I think what Bill Cosby did to those women is obviously horrible, right? It's obviously horrible. However, does that mean I shouldn't be able to go back and watch his early stand-up and appreciate that for what it is? I mean, I think we need to be big enough of adults to be able to say, well, yeah, this was a horrible person. Well, guess what? Probably most of what you enjoy as art was created by horrible people.
Yeah.
Right.
We're finding that out right now. We're finding that out.
We're finding that out.
They're like taking all the celebrities away. At this point, like we will have none. There will be no more entertainers. But what you just said is Seinfeld had an episode. I think it was he was interviewing Eddie Murphy, and they were talking about separating the art from the man. And that's kind of what you're saying. And again,
definitely,
it should be your choice, right? So, well, that's what we're starting to. Like, okay, Disney. This something here in the past. Cancel Disney. They were talking about canceling Hamilton. You know, the play.
Why were they canceling it? I thought that one was the sort of the toast of the cancel culture SJWs.
4 years ago, Hamilton was the best. A couple months ago, it was the worst because we were glorifying. They were all slave owners. They were slave owners, so we shouldn't watch that play. Right. So
but that was part of the irony of having them all do it as Black people.
Yes. Right? Well, and that's what people loved about it. Like all of a sudden there was a play that it didn't matter who you were. You were hired if you were the best. If you were the best singer, if you were the best rapper, if you were the best dancer, whatever it was, it didn't matter if George Washington was white or not. Like it was not played by a white man. And that's what was celebrated. This movie, or again, play, musical was awesome. And then all of a sudden I was like, wow, what is happening to us? And what I saw with that, Mark, is the hypocrisy of the dates. I'm like, wow. Every 4 years, American culture gets manipulated 6 months before the election.
That's right.
Literally, it was like, I looked at the date and it was like, okay, literally 4 years ago in June, Hamilton was performing in the Oval Office. Obama and Michelle were cheering. Everyone loved it. And then 4 years later, no, they're horrible. We're canceling them. And I thought, wow, this is so manipulative. And then same thing, other issues. We were talking about this before, and we want to touch on that. Like so many issues are being brought up and we're being triggered now before the election. And all of a sudden after the election, you don't see any videos on some of these subjects that we talk about for 6 months only. And then they go away.
Yeah. Well, remind me to talk about BLM in a second. But I want to kind of close a loop here about political correctness in general.
Oh yeah.
Well, 5G actually. Okay. So let's just make sure everything was kind of closed there. I think we covered that. Covered that pretty well. Yeah, a lot of open loops. Well, if anybody has any more questions about 5G, they go ahead and ask.
Yeah, drop them in. And Leon actually has a question about the social system, credit system. I'll bring that up. And by the way, a lot of the topics that Mark Joyner is talking about and beyond, like there are things we don't even have time to get into. Go to, roadmaptomoney.vip. You'll get the book completely free. It's his ebook right now. I don't know, in 6 months, it'll still be free or if it'll be a different system. But if you're watching this live, if you're watching this in the future, like say a week from now, go ahead. But he expands upon it. And like Mark's mind is this, I call you this creative genius because you dive into these subjects, you approach things and very diplomatically. Like I see you on social media and I don't think anyone really knows your politics because you're very open-minded. You look at both sides. You don't have a dog in the show, whatever that expression is. My grandmother, I think, passed down the I don't do cliches. For the longest time, I thought it was best thing since sliced bread. And I think slice of bread is how I always said it. That's how my Nana said it, sliced bread. So, and I think it's just because she wasn't born in this country and she came here and that's just, colloquialisms were changed. So I don't know what that is.
Sliced bread is correct, by the way. I think that is the correct colloquialism.
Yeah, and apparently it's sliced bread because before sliced bread, you just got a loaf of bread. And I'm like, and I was saying, it's the best thing since a slice of bread. Well, who cares about a slice of bread? And I didn't get it. So that's why I don't like cliches. But yeah, Mark doesn't have a political bias per se, as far as he's coming from this perspective, like so many people do, and they just try to ram their perspective down your throat. He's open-minded, but he also exposes a lot of things so that you can think for yourself. So I also want to get into a little bit of like the hope and how people can guard their mind. And if they do find themselves getting triggered, especially over the next couple months, and if they see they want to react to something, and again, unless it's your post and you get engagement, like what can they do about that? So that's a future question. But and I think Emily Krum is giving us horse in the race. I believe that's the correct.
It's another one. Yeah. Well, dog in this fight is another way. Yeah.
Fight. So there's two, and I'm mixing them both up. But yeah.
Here's Emily for
So that's what I love about you, Mark, is that you've got this open mind. Same thing with Jeremiah Aoyang. He's got friends from all different parties, all different walks of life. And to me, all of my friends, like Brad Costanzo will tell you, I used to call him my brother that I always wanted. Now I call him the brother I never wanted, because we will go at it. Like, we will go at it. One of the first protests here in San Diego was the small business owners who were saying no more lockdown, and they were protesting in the street. And he's like, if they ruin it for me, I'm going to be mad. I'm like, dude, this is what America is founded upon. Like, they have the right to say, like, this is not cool. We're not okay with this. We're not going to survive. They have that right. And he's like, but if he ruins my beat, so we'll go at it. And a lot of my friends, like, I have an atheist friend, we'll have like really high level religious discussions. But to me, if we don't have friends that have different opinions, and if we're not allowed and free to talk about these things, whether we get offended, triggered or not, like, let's have the conversations. And that's what I love about you, is on your page and on your profile and in your books, you have the deep conversations that other people aren't willing to have, or they're having it, but they're just yelling at each other and fighting with one another. So I love how you bring those. So go ahead. 5G, and then BLM.
So actually, there's one quick thing I wanted to inject here, and that's just something about political correctness, because I think it's very important for people to understand what's going on, because as much as I am kind of like politically agnostic, and I think that politics as they are today are probably going to be rendered obsolete by technology very soon. And if we're not having this political conversation without the context of the larger technological landscape, it's a bullshit conversation. I mean, there's just no point, right? However, there are some things I have very firm opinions on, and one thing I have a very, very firm opinion on is political correctness. Okay, and I'm going to just eviscerate PC culture right now for everybody watching decisively. Okay, so I'll explain to you how that's possible for all of us to do, and it comes down to a couple of very simple questions. Okay, the first question is there a central source that you can show me where there is a list of what is politically correct and what is not, and can you show me clearly the criteria that they use to make those decisions? And spoiler alert, you can't. Okay, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It's a constantly moving target. And here's the problem. It's a constantly moving target that is being chosen by people that you don't know through criteria of which you are not aware, right? So when people come to me and say, well, that's not politically correct, I just say, those are the questions I ask. I say, look, okay, so you come to me with this slur, that I just said something that was politically incorrect. Well, let's unpack that. What does that actually mean? And how are you determining what is politically correct? And how do I know, show me the central source, right? Show me the criteria that you're using to make those decisions. And they're generally, you'll get all sorts of, really, really convoluted answers in response to that. But what's interesting is some people will continue to cling to the PC culture despite that, because there's another psychological phenomenon, conformity to group norms. Right. And they have identified with certain groups that all say that, this politician is bad, this belief system is bad, this belief system is okay, these are the terms, the languages that you're supposed to use. And everybody just kind of like, oh, I better get in lockstep with everybody else because I don't want to be canceled. They're afraid. Yes. Most of them are afraid. And I mean, we can't go through life like that if we want this world to be a decent place, because if that is what we become, we're in deep shit. We're really in deep shit. I mean, pardon my language. I don't know if this is a cussing friendly zone or not, but
I'm from Jersey. I don't even notice it. I think the four-letter word these days are mask and COVID-19 and what else? What is another one? Actually, lean in is another one that I can't stand because so many people say it. But so you could say whatever you want on this show.
I'll give you an army cliche you can use. Lean forward in the foxhole. It's a little better.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
It's a little cooler.
Crawl, walk, run behind me. I don't know if you can see it on the chalkboard. Oh, I've got Adriana's. I don't know. Can you see that? No, maybe not. That was one of my military client friends. We were talking about like getting on video and doing it. He's like, you got to crawl, you got to walk, and then you run. I'm like, yes. Yeah. So your expression will go on the board next. And I'm going to bring you back as well, probably when I have Joel Comm on as well, because again, he doesn't mince words as well, and he just jumps into it, and he's doing a lot of research into cryptocurrency following that blockchain revolution. And I want to talk about that on a future show, and voting. So maybe we'll bring you back with him. I don't know if you have opinions on that, but go ahead, keep unpacking.
I do.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
And then also Adrian was also asking earlier as far as like, well, how do we find the truth? Because the other thing too that I want to get people to think about is stop just looking at the headline and seeing it as fact or getting triggered emotionally and freaking out. First of all, read the article. I don't think a lot of people are, but then do a little research and then look at the source. Where's the source coming from? That's always how I look at things. And I even have people that have sent me DMs. Someone sent me, and this is all around like, it's like April, and it was like all this new research about the virus and a vaccine and about how blah, 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 this came out. And I was like, oh, this is great news. And I went to share it, and I looked at it, it was like a month old. And I'm like, you're sharing literally old news. And if nothing's changed, that means this is BS, right? So there's people, like, be aware when you do share something. If you don't become the person that does a little bit of research and you pass on info, you're not going to be as trusted, right? So do a little bit of research so that you are like, we are all citizen journalists, right? Once Twitter came out and we had a little journalist broadcasting system in our pockets, we all became citizen journalists. We were taking pictures and videos of whether it was the earthquake or the fires in California, like, be aware, stay away from this road. Like, it was very helpful, but it can also be harmful, especially if we've got the trigger finger so fast to go share this before we do a little research. So if you could answer a little bit more with Adrienne, like, how does she find out the truth if people are manipulating what they're being seen, right? And we're getting all this censorship from YouTube, Facebook, right? They're censoring so many things. JP Sears, I don't know if you saw a video recently, he got canceled, or sorry, he got censored by YouTube. They took it out, and it was what it was like to believe everything the media tells you. And they canceled, they literally censored that video, and he's been on a tear, and he's a comedian. Like, he's just a funny guy. So I don't want to be in a country, in a world where all of a sudden free speech, you can't say anything just because someone doesn't agree or someone gets offended. Like, how do we protect ourselves, guard our mind, and not just get so triggered, especially over the next couple months?
Yeah. So if you could put Adrienne's question back up.
Sure.
So there's something I wanted to address there. So she was saying, how do we find primary sources and make intelligent decisions? And I think, you're asking a great question. How do you find primary sources? Well, first off, people have to understand what primary source is. Most people are not aware, right? So primary source is where you're getting something that is not an opinion on something, or is not a characterization of something, which is what most media is. It's actually the document itself that you can look at, document or source media of some form, right? So for example, I gave you guys some primary source reference points earlier. So for example, Operation Ajax. A primary source on Operation Ajax would be the Freedom of Information Act documents that were released about that. Anything that comes out from FOIA is primary source. If you've got undercover footage, that's going to be primary source. If you have, for example, WikiLeaks has got, primary source data that was leaked directly to it, and that was for example, they had footage, that the NSA had used in some drones or some drone attacks. And then they released that to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks then made that information available to people. And that, to me, is one of the best forms of journalism out there, is just providing people the raw information so that they can make decisions themselves on that information. Most of what we're experiencing in the news right now is not that. It's characterization of primary source with one political leaning or another, or not necessarily even a political leaning. Some of it is activist leaning. Some of it is interest group leaning. For example, if somebody is for or against the presence of Israel in the Middle East, there are multiple news sources that look at that through different lenses. And I've got people, I've got friends in Israel, and I've got friends in all the countries surrounding Israel, right? So I understand that from all of the different lenses that people can look at that. When you're reading articles, people think that their research is going out and reading articles, right? Articles are generally not research, right? Because you have to, in the best articles, they're going to point to primary source documentation where you can go corroborate what they are saying. But in many of these articles, they say, well, according to sources, because many sources have to be hidden from people. And I think that's maybe not necessarily a bad thing. However, if you look at the history of journalism, we can find out that there are many clear cases where people have abused the anonymous source law, right? So, for example, there's a great film you can watch about this, a biopic called Shattered Glass. And it's a film about a gentleman, I think it was Philip Glass. He was a journalist at National Review, and he was caught fabricating a story whole cloth. And then it turned out that there were about 12 or so stories that he fabricated whole cloth. Like he invented a computer convention invented the names of companies, invented events that happened at these, fictitious events. It was, I mean, absolutely astonishing how egregiously he abused that. And he got away with that for years in National Review, and they had to retract 12 issues of the National Review as a result of that. Okay, so to let people understand, that's only one case where somebody got caught.
Right,
okay?
right.
That's a case where somebody got caught. This is going on all over the world. There are many, many different cases of it. And it's just, so we have to be, very, very clear about that, right? So now that's not to say that all journalism is bad, not to say that all commentary is bad, but if the commentary is there without sourcing, then you need to be extremely careful about what they're saying there, because you could, especially if you share that information with other people, to people who are a little bit more switched on, they're going to kind of like look at you and go, okay, well, you just shared me a documentation that doesn't, or a journalistic article that doesn't have any documentation at all. I'm going to look at somebody who forwards me something like that and say, well, what am I supposed to do with this? Show me the corroborating evidence, and then maybe I'll have an opinion. So, so where do we find primary source? Well, I mean, you have to identify what it is, and then just, you're going to find it all over the place. There's plenty of it, available. Project Veritas is one very interesting right-leaning source that has all sorts of, primary source documentation for what they do. They go out and they do surreptitiously shot undercover footage, and they use that to expose things that are against their political agenda. But I mean, whatever your feelings are about their leanings, at least you can look at their primary source documentation, including, for example, they have exposés of insiders from Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Google coming out and talking about some of the problems that they have experienced, and some of the things that they have observed, saying that, yeah, there is a clear political bias in those organizations. And there are primary sources to back that up. There are interviews with the people actually saying it. Right. And they actually show the documentation and all of that. So that's how you can identify that. There are other activist organizations like WikiLeaks, where that was available. And so once you know what primary source is, you're going to, there's also, websites like LiveLeaks, where you can go see raw footage. And by the way, be very careful before you go to that website, because there are a lot of crazy things that you're going to find on LiveLeaks. Some of them quite shocking. So you definitely don't want to send your kids there unless they're, of age where it's their mind is strong enough to be able to guard themselves against that. But that's the kind of thing that you need to be looking for. And you need to be looking for analyses by people who are willing to back stuff up. However, be aware that even that is dangerous. So I'll give you an example. Noam Chomsky is, in terms of scholarship, I absolutely totally have high respect for the guy, because everything that the guy says, he's very, very careful about backing that up with primary source and references. When he makes a statement about something. However, he just comes to conclusions that I don't agree with at all, right? Most of them. Some of them. There's some things he says that I might agree with, but the reason I'm bringing this up is you have to be very careful. You could have somebody write an article that comes to a conclusion that's backed up by primary source. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree with their conclusion, right? So ask yourself, and what I'm reading now, what can be verified? What can I know? What can I not know? And what is this journalist trying to tell me that is outside of the realm of what I can know and what I've seen, with my own eyes, right? And if you conduct yourself that way, you're going to do fairly well, but it's still very difficult because, even when you've got, tons of evidence, try proving a murder in court, for example. It's harder than people think. Right. So, this gets, we can get into a very deep epistemological rabbit hole of what can be known and what can't be, but that's sort of the best way to start, I would say.
Robin was saying, I good academically, yet philosophically, I disagree. And
same.
And then, so the last thing, there's a billion other things I'd love to talk about with you. So we're definitely bringing you back on, and maybe we'll bring Joel as well. But BLM, and again, that this was, I think a lot of people, so it started as a movement, right? Or at least that's what we saw. And in marketing, we see this where you'll start a group around a movement and it promotes your the business or the company behind it or whatever, but it's around a movement, as opposed to like, nobody cares about XYZ company, but if you create a movement, people passionately share it, passionately get behind it, passionately be a member of it. And so we saw this with Black Lives Matter. And first there was that as a statement, as a protest, and then people were agreeing that with this as a statement. And now we're seeing the controversy, and you posed one of these questions, and Harris Feldman, a mutual friend of ours and in the digital marketing industry, you guys went back and forth, and it was fascinating because at first he was like, oh man, you tricked me. But then like he was open to the conversation, which was really, really a good dialogue back and forth. Because first I was like, oh, I'm backing up from this conversation. This is getting, but you were both open, which was fascinating. But I don't think a lot of people realize that there's Black Lives Matter as a philosophy, as a statement, as a belief, that sentence, we say, yes, we support. However, it's been hijacked. And talk a little bit about that, because I don't think people realize it. And that's what you exposed in that article, because I didn't have a clue until I went and I researched. I'm like, oh, this is where your money's going to. So all these people, and millions, I don't know the exact number, if you know, everyone was thinking we were contributing to the community to like help the community. And, I'm thinking like, hey, we're getting maybe scholarships and we're helping businesses, right? And help them flourish. There's actually someone who came up with a wonderful solution. We'll talk about him again later, but talk a little bit about the movement and what maybe people don't realize when they go to the organization to donate. It's not necessarily going to where they think it's going to.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting conversation. So, I know a lot of people who are involved in BLM, and, we have to unpack and understand these different things. So there's the sentiment of Black Lives Matter, which I think, most people, unless you're like actually egregiously racist, would probably agree with that, right? Yeah, exactly. And somehow all lives matter became a slur, and I don't know how that happened. Yeah. But anyway, the really interesting thing here is that there's the sentiment, and then there are different organizations. Right. And there's the central organization, what became the central organization. So if you go to blacklivesmatter.com, that is run by Black Lives Matter Foundation Incorporated. And I'll talk about that here in a second. But what I want to point out is that there are individual local activist organizations that many of them have disavowed any connection to the BLM national, right? Now, what's very interesting is that it's interesting how those riots started to spread out into countries where the same problem just doesn't exist, right? Like the recent uptick in riots for George Floyd. I was kind of astonished at how countries where they don't even have armed police officers were rioting in the streets about that topic. And that tells me I have to, my radar's kind of going off there. Like, I don't think that that's a wholesome phenomenon going on there. I don't think that was spontaneous. My gut is telling me that there's a little more to that.
I was watching their commentary, and they were like, okay, this 4 years ago, it was an organic movement, right? It came from the people. It came. And then he was looking at it now. And again, this is someone from the community and a leader. And he's like, this is not organic. This looks organized, right? And there's a lot of people that are infiltrating it. So so that's kind of what you're saying is like your radar is going up. It's like, is this organic? Is this of the people, by the people? Or are there some organization going on? Is there some organization going on?
Well, there's clearly some organization. I mean, if you look at Black Lives Matter Foundation Incorporated, it's very interesting. You can find the people who are in charge of Black Lives Matter Foundation Incorporated, which, by the way, are different people. The original founders, the guys who took over that and then turned it into Black Lives Matter Foundation Incorporated. They're on tape saying, on tape, that shows how old I am. on videos saying, that they are trained Marxists.
Right.
Okay? And I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. Okay, this is their own words. And if you go to their website, I'll tell you. So if you go to blacklivesmatter.com and then type on what we believe, one of the things that they say there is, we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, that first sentence, they follow it up with a whole bunch of nice language, but we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement. Right. Let that sink in for a minute, okay? Do we want to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure? And by the way, that's not just Western, okay? The nuclear family is actually a lot stronger in Asia, all right? It's a lot stronger in Asia right now than it is in the West, right?
Yeah.
In the West, it has been disrupted far more. If you go back to the East, it's a very, very different thing. Okay, so that's what they stand for. All right. So, but we have to be the problem with this is, there was the original movement, which got hijacked, which happened, by the way, to many, many political movements over time. It happened to the Tea Party. It happened to other organizations. The interesting thing is that because that language is so powerful and people don't want to look like they're racists,
right,
you have to agree with that and say, yeah, I support Black Lives Matter. And then they go to blacklivesmatter.com and then they contribute to that. Well, that's what you're supporting.
Right.
That's what you're supporting.
Right.
And do you actually, are you for that? Are you for disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family? Do you really, are you going to tell me that that's a good idea? Right. I would say that all of the psychological literature would tell you that that's probably a pretty bad idea because, single parenting corroborates or correlates pretty well with crime and with drug abuse.
Yeah.
So I'm not so sure if that's what we should be standing for. And but that's not something that people will dig into. They'll just say, well, yeah, Black Lives Matter. Everybody's saying this. All the celebrities are saying it. And of course, I'm not a racist, so I'm going to go contribute to that. Yeah. Well, you didn't dig deep enough.
Right. Yeah. And that was the conversation back and forth. And Harris was like, oh, you tricked me into donating. It's like, no, we were just having the conversation. And he was like, and he's like, and
I love Harris. I love Harris.
Yeah. He's like, and I'm glad because again, he and I are like, okay, well, this is a good cause, right? We didn't think there was something else beyond that. And it's interesting. So again, the people that are willing to have conversations, like some of the things were like, that's what we're talking about, like kind of changing the expression so that it means what it originally meant. And then someone was like, well, but saying Black Lives Matter also, or two, there were a couple other things like there's just not a ring to it. Whereas again, we know
all Black Lives Matter is another one that people are saying.
Yeah. So again, I don't know. And maybe there is, maybe we take it back and we come up with a better expression and we come up with something that there's two different, right? There's one organization that's Marxist and there's one that's just, we want to support the Black community and help people. So that again, it's a dilemma. And what I'm seeing now again in the feed, because everyone shares this. And then there's this, outrage porn. Brad Costanzo and I had talked about this on the TV show like 2 seasons ago. When do you remember when the shooting happened? And this is October 1st. The anniversary is coming up in about a month in Vegas, and the network was trying to tell me what I needed to say, and I was like, "But we don't know what happened. We don't know if this is a terrorist. We don't know if this was this." And they're just feeding me information, and I'm like, I'm not a journalist. I'm just a host of a show, and I'm not saying something if I don't know that there's facts. So I don't think that's the other thing is people don't realize in the media there's such manipulation that one network will just make sure everyone is saying the same thing. And unless someone stands up and says, I'm willing to lose the show because I'm not going to say what you want me to say, because there's no, and there was no evidence. There was no, he wasn't a terrorist. He was just a crazy person. Right. So,
who knows?
So Brad Costanzo was on the show that day. It was like literally the first day. Like I was like, I'm going to make this a fun show. And then I see Perry Belcher post. It's like midnight of what happened in Vegas. I'm like, oh my gosh, tomorrow morning's the beginning of the show. We had to rework it. But one of the things we started talking about is outrage porn. So people will see something that's like, it just outrages them. And then they share it. So like one of the things that is coming up in my feed a lot over the past like 24 to 48 hours is people in this movement going and like terrorizing people, going into restaurants and forcing them to raise a fist and say it. And they're like,
and there's primary source on that.
Yeah.
That's a very well documented phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
But that's, go ahead.
I'm just hoping people will wake up and be open to a conversation and not just closed off and just one way of thinking and everyone has to act a certain way. It's like there's people, and again, same thing. We'll talk about this again maybe in a future show, but I did a post about this several months ago. As far as Kaepernick and Nate Boyer. So Nate Boyer, I wound up getting to know him through a client of mine. He's a big supporter of his company. And he's the one who had the conversation with Kaepernick and saying, listen, how can you make a statement without being disrespectful to veterans? And that's how the whole Take a Knee came about. And like, at first I saw it, I'm like, oh my God, like this is a moment that is like, it's a moment you think about the fallen, you think about people who've died for our country. So originally I saw it as a disrespect thing, but I looked into the story and Nate Boyer had this conversation and he's like, listen, for our fallen brothers, we'll kneel at their grave, we'll kneel in remembrance of them. And we take a knee for those fallen men. So could you do that for your brothers that you're standing for? That's what it meant. And I was like, wow, that had a totally different meaning for me, right? And then it became a protest where it's like you're honoring and protesting and creating some controversy, right? Because it gets in the media because people are emotionally charged about that, but yet without being disrespectful. But I didn't see that way at first until I dug a little deeper and found out about Nate Boyer and what he was doing. And now we're seeing the same thing. It's like, don't just expect people to do one thing or another and then just put them in a box and think they're one way. That may not be the case, right? So now you have also a lot of people that are Christians that are like, I don't bow to anyone. It's a belief system, right? It's a belief. Right. So now you're saying you have to, and we're starting to see now everyone kneeling except the one person who's like, this goes against my religious beliefs. So again, everything's a controversy. And one of the discussions that I have with my friends, it's like, if the protest didn't make you uncomfortable, then it's not a protest that's worth having, because you're not getting the conversation to happen. So I'm about, let's get the conversation to happen. And then how can we fix it? Like, what's a solution? So maybe we can just kind of tie this up. First of all, everyone that is on the show, go to, I'll bring up the link here. Go to roadmaptomoney.vip, get Mark Joyner's book. He delves into so many different things: technology, the future, robots, 3D printing. There's so many things. You can talk a little bit more about that, but give us some solution and hope. Veronica Montalongo earlier was saying how she's like, hope. Like, give us some hope. Where is her comments? But yeah, what are some solutions that we can focus on?
So one of the things I talk about in the roadmap, and I'll just encourage everybody to read this to get a deeper dive, something I call the 3 essential hedges, right?
Yes.
And I'm going to kind of leave that as an open loop so people will go and read the book, because I want you to experience the whole conversation. So I just want to say something I want to address something you said earlier, just very briefly. When somebody compels me to speak in a certain way or to express myself in a certain way, I'm always going to be resistant of that, no matter what it is. Like, I remember, I saw some of those videos of those kids raising up their hand and telling people, you have to raise your hand. And if you don't right now, if you don't raise your fist, I'm going to scream at you. And I would be like, well, scream away, because, I could have been an ally, but now you've completely alienated me because you're trying to tell me what to do. And I'm just not on principle. I'm going to disobey. And when people start to make issues like that, or they, or when people take, a symbol. I mean, this symbol means different things to different people. That take an E thing means different things to different people. I mean, like, okay, I'm not going to be any part of that, right? Because I don't know what people mean by it, and I don't know how they're going to manipulate it, right? So, in terms of hope, the really interesting thing here is that all of this, and your roadmap to money is obvious because in the title, it's your roadmap to money, right? It's it's based on the notion that entrepreneurialism is going to be spurred on by all of this. But we have to understand that our entrepreneurial efforts have to be conducted in the context of what's actually happening in the world in technology. If we don't do business in the context of what's happening in the world in technology, then we're not doing business correctly, right? Because we don't understand the battlefield that we're partaking in right now in the moment. So that's the really exciting thing, is that all of these things happening present enormous economic opportunity for people who are aware of what's going on. However, the thing that I would have to caveat that with is this: what was working in the past, what was selling in the past, is going to change. It's going to change. So people talk about this new normal. Well, the roadmap book came out like several weeks before the whole virus thing happened, right? And a lot of things that I predicted in the book are now coming true. Like, I predicted the civil unrest that we're seeing. I predicted the existence of autonomous zones. Which a lot of this stuff just started happening right away. Well, the thing that I'm trying to help people get their head around is that the pace of change is going to be very rapid from this point forward, because technology has facilitated rapid change in everything. And the pace of technological change is going to be so rapid. You need to be prepared for that. So you need to be prepared for your product becoming obsolete overnight. You need to be prepared for some advancement or some decision in technology rendering your marketing obsolete overnight. And if you're not doing that, you're building your business like a castle on sand, right? It's a very, very shaky foundation if you don't make your guiding light the landscape of technology. But when you do that, and you understand how to observe these trends and how to see where they're going, what you can do is you can get the the benefit of foresight. being the guy who invented the tracking pixel, started the first ebook company and all that. I mean, that, I was able to do those things because I was able to see where technology was going and what was needed, right? And I just simply jumped on opportunities. If you don't understand the technological landscape, you can't make decisions like that.
Yeah. It's when I read that, how you created the tracking pixel, I was like, whoa, like that was, because this is what we talk about in the past several years, but you were doing that in 2001, as far as 2002.
Even earlier than that. Yeah. In the 1990s.
I was a social worker then, so I don't know what you're talking
about. It was the 1990s.
It's only what I'm aware of. That's the reality. That's my reality.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, that should be your reality because that's the one you can verify.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
Just to tell, if you're tuning in late, definitely want to watch this replay. If you're tuning in from the future, type a comment what your thoughts are. And again, I want to have more conversations about this, and I want to come up with solutions, because some of the things there's just a lot of issues, there's a lot of problems, and this is a conversation that is not just summed up in an hour, and we're going over a bit because Mark just blows your mind on all these things. So this is a conversation I want you to continue having. Drop out what your thoughts are, and what are some solutions? What are some solutions that you think? So I think it's Robert F. Smith came up with the 2% solution. And that's where, they were talking about, okay, in the Black Lives Matter community, I'm like, okay, we're talking about the problems, but what about solution? If you just do a Google search, I believe it's Robert F. Because I was thinking about Robert F. Kennedy. So it's Robert F. Smith, and he talks about the 2% solution, and it's these corporations. I think Yahoo adopted it. He's like, Yahoo as a company said this is a great idea.
Yeah.
I don't know if they've done it yet, but essentially putting 2%. So it's building the wealth in the Black community and building Black businesses. And I'm like, that's what I would donate to, right? Yeah. Because it's literally going to people that you want it to go to. You're bringing up a community at large and building real wealth. So that's his big focus. And he's a multi-billionaire or runs a multi-billionaire hedge fund. So in Wall Street, and his recommendation, the 2% solution, if you watch the whole video, it's phenomenal. But it's, Yahoo, Amazon, all these organizations, and they all haven't done it yet. And then, okay, so you get Target to do it. Walmart, its competitor, will do it. And they give 2% to the community. And you build wealth. You give loans to Black-owned businesses, right? And I'm like, this is phenomenal, because this is how you get the infrastructure. Because, my friends and I are having these conversations. I'm like, well, what's the systemic? Like, I keep hearing the systemic. What's the systemic? And, they'll send me movies and documentaries. And then that was the first person I saw, the first leader that was like, here's a solution. And I think it's a solution we can all get behind, right? So, and what I love about it, again, it's free enterprise. Once you get one corporation doing it, you've got pressure with another organization to contribute to a good cause. And it's this goodwill marketing and the competition, right? They'll get involved just because it's competition. So do a little research into Robert F. Smith and watch his YouTube videos. He has several of them. Phenomenal. What's behind you? What's the circle behind you?
Oh, I don't know if you could see it. Okay. Well, it's too bright for you guys to see my whiteboard. So basically what I was going to talk about was what I call the 3 essential hedges. And you guys can't see the whiteboard because it's way too bright right now in Phuket. But if you imagine a wheel with 3 wedges in it, right? 3, equal wedges. So that's the 3 essential hedges. You got to have all 3 of these in place. Otherwise, the wheel's kind of broken if you've only got 1 or 2. So what I'm going to do is, and this is talked about in your roadmap to money. And by the way, there's a masterclass that people can get for free as well, where I do a much deeper dive. Thank you for that. That is the wheel. So if you've only got 1 of these hedges, you're in deep doo-doo. Okay, you've got to have all 3. So I'm because I really want people to get the full context of the book. I'm only going to talk about 1, right? And it's one that's a nice counterpoint to what your friend was saying, right? So hedge number 1 is that the only assets that matter are your skills, your knowledge, and your health. Okay. Now, people might hear that and say, well, are you telling us not to get rich? And no, I want you to become, fabulously wealthy, right? I'd like you to become a millionaire, if not better, right? However, you've got to understand the context of what that wealth actually means. And it doesn't mean what most people think it means. So, for example, if you have, let's just say you had money in the bank, okay? Your currency could be rendered valueless overnight if the market goes through hyperinflation, right? If there's a revolution or a war in your country, Just ask anybody who lived through the Weimar Republic, went through the Cuban Revolution, went through the Iraq War, lived in Zimbabwe over the last several decades. I mean, these are all cases where currencies were rendered worthless and devalued. And that can happen at any time. That can happen at any time. And all of these events are surprises, by the way. Another reason why, now you might say, okay, well, why don't I just put all of my money in hard assets then? Well, your hard assets could be seized by governments through what we in the US, we call eminent domain. And the eminent domain law was invented during the Civil War so that we could allow Civil War commanders to commandeer somebody's home so that they could allow the soldiers to be sheltered for the night. Now, that's probably a pretty good idea. If you've got soldiers that are protecting you from the raping and pillaging of enemy combatants, you want those soldiers to be well rested. Probably a good idea. However, since then, that law has been used.
They've abused it.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
They have abused it quite egregiously. I mean, and by the way, every country in the world has something similar to eminent domain on the books. And there are, petty officials and, corrupt politicians, who have gone around and abused that rule. And it happens every single day in every world, in every country in the world. Yeah. So another thing is, so you might say, okay, well, why don't I put my money in the stock market? Well, the stock market is extremely volatile. And if you've seen any of the market corrections that have occurred over the last several decades, there are people who lost their entire life savings or had their retirement funds wiped out in these market corrections. So, none of these things are the sure bets that we think that they are. A lot of people think that, okay, I can allow myself to get sick and unhealthy and I don't have to worry about anything as long as I've got enough money. Man, God help you if that's the way you're thinking, because all of those things are so volatile. All of those things are so volatile. So if you focus on your skills, knowledge, and health, those are things that can't be taken away from you, right? I mean, unless force gets really bad, then maybe they can take your health away, right? Which is quite possible, depending on how egregious a particular government gets in the way that they're conducting their business. But if you focus on skills, knowledge, and health, you've got a much better foundation in a dynamically changing world. And right now we are at the most rapidly paced, dynamically changing world that we have ever experienced in recorded history. Yeah. So, think about that, right? Think if you're not prioritizing your health right now, if you had allowed yourself to become sick and obese as, and I allowed myself to become, or earlier on in my life because, success got to my head and I allowed that to become the gauge of who I was. I didn't understand how vitally important that was. So I shifted my priorities. So I said, okay, now health has got to be something that I take extremely seriously. I can't allow myself to become sick because no money in the world is going to save you if you've got something that nobody can cure or nobody can fix.
Yeah. Right? It's interesting that you just brought that up because I remember reading something about how you had shifted and you were obese and got into shape. And I read, and you can correct me if this is wrong or you can verify if it's true, that you ran, was it the New York Marathon in bare feet?
I ran it. So I don't know if you know Telman Knudsen, but Telman is one of the, So Telman's a good buddy of mine. And so he, when he was on Necker Island with Richard Branson, he came up with this idea to, so I told Telman, I said, look, he wanted to take his business to the next level. And I told him, I said, you need to come up with a publicity stunt. Okay. That will yeah, well, this one did backfire. Okay. It did, but I mean, but I mean, cheers to him for trying, right? I mean, he gave it a shot, right? So the publicity stunt that he came up with, because he wanted to launch onto the national landscape, was to run across country barefoot and to do it for charity. And so Richard Branson was supposed to go do the first 10K with him. Richard backed out, and so Telman invited me to go do it in his stead. And I hadn't never run a half marathon before. I thought, okay, I'm just going to do the 10K, and I'll do the 10K barefoot. But I was doing so well at the end of the 10K, I ended up doing the full half marathon that he did. That was his one leg for that day. By the way, so he went through a couple of states. Yeah, barefoot through Manhattan. So we started down in Battery Park, at the bottom of Manhattan, and then ran all the way across. We went all the way up Manhattan across the bridge.
I wouldn't even want to walk barefoot in Battery Park. I'm just saying.
I know. It's a little sketchy.
Oh,
yeah, you just don't step on the needles. Don't step on the needles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, it was cool. And Tillman, gave it a good shot, and he didn't make it. But anyway, to get back to skills, knowledge, and health, I had a shift in consciousness about this. I realized, hey, wait a minute. I had been brainwashed to believe that what's important is not important. And that something that's actually not anywhere near as important is the thing that you need to focus on. I was taught to focus on something that was not perennial, something that was actually quite volatile. And that's, if money is your measuring stick of your value in this life, you're in really deep trouble, I have to say. And again, it's not a bad thing inherently, but if it's not backed up by other things, you're going to be in for a very rude awakening. I mean, it's happened to most affluent people I know. They find that their money is not, it's not going to solve the problem. I mean, they're still the same person.
Yeah.
They still have the same problems, and the money can help solve a lot of those problems. Don't get me wrong. There's no question about it. However, you really have to factor in that, you could be penniless tomorrow through events that you have no control over. That's something that we all need to face.
Yeah, I think we've seen that since March. People are like, what the heck, right? And again, it's events beyond their control, right?
That's right.
The stock market, all of these things, all of a sudden something happens that threatens. Who would think the travel industry, airlines, cruises, all of these things would be in such peril right now, right? Like you look at all the things that have gone bankrupt. It's just insane. I mean, how many restaurants will survive this? Who knows, right? Yeah. So what you wrote before March 2020 is so much more relevant. Everyone has to read his book, Roadmap to Money. You can get it free if you go to roadmap2money.vip. Phenomenal book. And again, it's a big book, but it's super easy because he gives me lots of pictures. I was telling you before, I was like, I love your book because it's filled with full of mind-opening things and philosophical things and technology things that I love, but also there's a lot of pictures and diagrams to explain what you're talking about. So you could even just read it as a picture book and you'll get through it very quickly. Any final words before we bring you on another show in the future to talk more about some of the things we didn't talk about in your book? Like the
I'd love to come back. So, just as, in closing, I would just advise people to, be aware of the technological landscape, to educate themselves about the technological landscape, and to use that as the primary guide that they're making their decisions on. Because that is something that we can know empirically, truly is not going to change. What people's political opinions are may or may not matter, right? And by the way, political power may be eroded by technological advancement. So we were talking earlier about everything, going through the big five phenomena of, getting faster, smaller, more powerful, more available, and cheaper, right? And that's happening to weapons technology as well. When that happens to weapons technology to an extent, that the monopoly of force that governments enjoy right now is eroded. When that happens, we're going to be in a very, very different world.
Yeah.
Right. So just let that sink in and let that be your guide for what you believe, what you think is a good idea. Most of the political discussion that's happening right now is last century's conversation.
Yeah.
The real discussion has to be based on what's actually happening in the world and what the technological landscape of the future is going to look like and what we can know about that. And there are many, many strong indicators that landscape is going to radically change very, very rapidly, very rapidly with 5G, Internet of Things, nanomaterial revolution, with quantum computing, with all of these things happening. The way that the world is right now is going to look very, very different in the next couple of years.
And so I feel, first of all, he covers a lot of this in his book, so go grab it. But I think that's what we're going to talk about as far as the political landscape, how it's going to change on the next show. And maybe we'll bring Joel because he gets very passionate about stuff that he kind of almost stole the show last time. I was like, wow, I thought you were just going to be like, no, TikTok's bad. He had lots of opinions he shared. So I feel it's going to be a fun discussion with the two of you. So yeah, thanks, Robin. Go to roadmap2money.vip, get Mark Joyner's book, get everything Mark has, really. I love all your stuff. Love it. And is this still in print? Because if people can get this book, this is my favorite. It's like a classic. Or is this a coveted?
Well, the print books are getting there was a while there where the cheapest one was like $2,000 on Amazon in print. But yeah, How much did you get it for?
I don't know. And I don't know if this came with a $2,000 product that I bought from you. So it's very possible that this is a $2,000. Good. So now I know how much this is worth. So yeah.
It's a good investment. You might have your money back. Who knows?
I had a friend that said something about like getting rid of my library. My camera's twisted a little. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like I purged a lot of them or given them or lent them to people and you never get it back. I'm like, this is the most valuable thing I own. Like forget the diamonds. Like it's the books that I cherish. I
still have thousands of books sitting in a storage facility in San Bruno, California.
Yeah. Well, if you ever want me to, babysit them for you, I have a huge other bookshelf out there that I just have like tchotchkes on. So let me know if you want me to babysit your book. By the way,
I got to do something with them.
By the way, how is Phuket?
Phuket it's interesting now. The lockdown is mostly eased up. However, the problem is they haven't opened Phuket back up to tourism. Right. So a lot of businesses have been hit very, very hard. Many will never open back up. Even some of the very affluent owned businesses were decimated in this process. I'm in a beautiful architecturally designed villa, and the guy who designed the architect owns some restaurants here, and even him, and this dude's like a member of the Thai royal family. Even his one of his restaurants is now shut down permanently as a result of this. This dude is not. This guy is a member of a family that is headed by a billionaire. He's got money, but the economic situation changed such that he simply can't support that restaurant anymore, right? Yeah. So if it hit him, the point of that is not to say boo-hoo for the guy that's a member of the Tyrell family, but to say, look, if it can affect somebody like that negatively, think about the people who are economically impoverished.
Yeah, they can't survive it. Yeah. They cannot survive it. By the way, this is going to be my last question for you is, okay, so we did this 2-week lockdown to slow the spread, to make sure hospitals aren't overwhelmed. We're now 6 months into it. We've opened up, we've closed, we've opened. What is there a mindset that people are in because they wore the badge, save lives, stay home, and they think that, okay, now if you open up, you're going to kill people. Like, so it's this, that's what I look at mind control too, is like, what's the message that has to get out there for people to start opening up the world again and getting back to saving it?
Man, well, first off, we need to be able to have a conversation about this without people melting down. Yeah. I don't know how we started politicizing, our choice of treatment in this, for example. To me, from my recollection, hydroxychloroquine was not a controversial substance.
Yeah, it never was.
Yeah, and I mean, hydroxychloroquine is actually the less dangerous predecessor to quinine.
Right.
And quinine has been used quite safely for decades, right? So HCQ is less potentially damaging than that. I just don't get the controversy, man. I mean, that's clearly a politicized decision. And then also, I frankly question the wisdom of the lockdown itself. Was this a really good idea? I mean, think about it, right? If the whole idea was about flattening the curve so that hospitals could prepare, well, hospitals haven't been spending that time preparing. They've been laying staff off. They haven't been diverting the staff over to COVID response. No, I know a lot of people. I mean, outside of emergency rooms who've been laid off. So none of what we're seeing makes any sense at all. And just the numbers themselves. There's very strong reason to believe that some of those numbers have been inflated. When hospitals get a subsidy from the government every time they declare a death as COVID related, well, then they're economically incentivized to change the way that they're reporting the numbers. So I don't see how we can expect those numbers to not be artificially inflated. So what are we actually dealing with here? Now, by the way, if somebody lost, somebody to COVID, I mean, don't take what I'm saying out of context. I'm not saying, anything about that. I'm just saying we should question.
Right.
We should question. And it's all together. We don't know necessarily that somebody died from COVID, right? It could be that they had other extenuating circumstances and that they were diagnosed with COVID and that those other things, might have killed them the same way a flu might have or what have you, right? So Robin Kirk says Sweden is the mindset. Yeah, so maybe, it doesn't seem like Sweden has taken a worse hit than any of us as a result of their, more or less, voluntary social distancing, right? Yeah. So Robin said, I knew people who took HCQ or quinine for years. Yeah. I mean, I knew people who had malaria. I met, a guy in Indonesia many years ago in Bali, and he was like the first legit malaria patient I ever met. And he was like, hey man, can you spare me, some money for some quinine? And I was like, well, tell me about that. Like, why? And he explained to me the whole thing about how that disease works. And yeah, I mean, quinine was a godsend for him, and there was no danger in him taking that. So yeah, I don't know what to say about this situation. I don't trust the mainstream narrative about it at all, quite frankly. And I don't see why there's any reason why I should trust them, because there's enough information out there to bring all of that into question.
Yeah.
So
for you, it's not necessarily an expression or a reprogramming. It's just starting to get people to open up their mind and question everything.
Yeah, I mean, we should always be questioning everything. Yeah. I mean, but we don't, for the most part. Even folks like you and me, Deb. I mean, you and I are a little more switched on to these notions than the average person is. But there are probably things that you and I expose ourselves to throughout the day where we just don't think about it. And you have to get better and better.
Until we do, right? Like, or until you have a conversation with someone else and you're like, oh, never thought of that, and like I had a discussion with my stylist recently, and I probably have the best, most philosophical conversations with my stylist that maybe every girl does, but we're just talking about that. Like, if you haven't changed you're lucky, you could do it yourself. So you have no stylist therapist. But yeah, like if you haven't changed your mind about something, if you haven't altered your perspective about something in the past year, 5 years, 10 years, like, are you ever really growing? If you don't surround yourself with people and question things, as opposed to just taking the narrative, right? Taking the narrative of what we're being fed. So those are the things that I am hoping that people will come out of this, not thinking one way or another, just starting to question things, right? And having an open mind. Like, that's one of the conversations with Jeremiah Algang. I'll have to introduce you if you don't know him. Up in Silicon Valley, he's a thought leader, but he's so open-minded, and he's taking opinions from all walks of life, all political parties. And it's fascinating when I see people answering him, because I think a lot of different types of people follow him. And I was like, he asked one thing recently about what do you think about people? What are adjectives you would describe about people who are actually thriving in this circumstance, right? And I'm like, they were innovative, they pivoted, they were humble, because they were like, hey, again, the veteran that was creating jeans, he went to PPE, like garments for the hospital and masks, and a restaurant went into creating, he was like a fine sushi restaurant. He went into doing like catered food and bringing them into the hospitals. Like, they all shifted. So I'm thinking like innovative. And then all of these people like answering were like lucky, privileged. Like, I'm like, these people were like, the one company was going to go out of business last year, and she pivoted completely because she's like, well, here's the need. I'm going to serve the market. Right.
The grand irony of people in Silicon Valley being so, left leaning and social justice-y these days is that Silicon Valley wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for, the Ayn Rand libertarians that started Silicon Valley.
Wow.
I mean, that whole thing was,
I didn't know that.
Well, I mean, and this is not controversial. This is just history. This is history. There's a great film you can watch, a great historical film. So Adam Curtis is a great documentarian, and he did a documentary called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And it's about, I think it's like a 6-hour romp that you got to go through. It's pretty long. However, it's a little long, but one of the things that he talks about is that actual history of Silicon Valley, and then how all of that shifted and that changed.
I mean, that's total libertarian. That's like anti-government. That's like, who is John Galt? I actually met the guy that was running the Ayn Rand Institute, and he's in Orange County. And there was a whole issue where he had to move just because they just kept chasing you out if you were making any money. I didn't know it was up in Silicon Valley though. That's interesting. It's interesting.
So the Ayn Rand thing, I mean, there were two different institutes, by the way. There was like the Ayn Rand Institute and I think the Atlas Society or something like that. I was friends with Nathaniel Branden. He was Ayn Rand's lover before he passed away. He started one of the offshoots, but because Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden had a falling out because they were both married and they were lovers. Right. When they split, they sort of, spurred off two different intellectual children of that movement. But the whole that, so I'm not saying that existed there, but that inspired the people in Silicon Valley. All of those guys were, very much people who read those books and were, very much, libertarian in their thinking. And they were like, hey, look, we're going to use technology to facilitate change in the world. That was their idea.
To make the world a better place, right? Like that's
the world a better place.
Tagline of Silicon Valley, right? And tech. Yeah.
It has changed into something a little bit different. I wouldn't say, I mean, if their definition of making the world a better place is censoring people, then
yeah,
I would have to disagree. But that's kind of what we're looking at right now. That's the reality.
Yeah. Well, I think we have about 5 different subjects for our next show. So you're going to be a regular guest. Whether he likes it or not, no free choice here.
That's right. I have to do it. All right, I'm out. I would love to come back anytime, Dan.
Thank you so much. Love that you're here. Father of digital marketing, ran through Battery Park, New York City, barefoot, crazy, slightly. Opinionated but open-minded is what my adjectives would be for you. Robin Kirk, Adam Curtis documentary movie I'll watch. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you took notes for me because I'm like trying to scribble over here and I'm gonna like rewatch this just to get all the resources here.
Very worthwhile to watch.
Oh, and there's Matt Gill. You know Matt Gill, yes?
I do. He's a good old friend.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Love that you're here, Matt. I think you might be the next guest too, Matt. I think you might be the next guest too. And then Robin Kirk, thank you for coming. I really enjoyed this conversation as I also believe we should question everything. And I mean everything. Yes, agreed. Great note to end on. I'm going to say aloha, even though I'm not in Hawaii anymore. I'm in California, but you're in Phuket. So how do we say goodbye in Phuket?
I don't know. I just know when they greet each other, they say sawadee ka or sawadee kap.
Yeah.
Kap if you're a man. I don't know how they say goodbye, actually.
Oh, there's 2 different based on masculine and feminine. I didn't know that. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Swadee Kap. I'm going to say hello.
Yeah, the high form is krap, actually.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, Mark. I'm going to end this broadcast, but I'm going to have him here in there, do a little debrief. But thank you. Swadee Kap.
Thank you guys.
We say hello when